The morning Elliot Dufresne walked out of the Brampton courthouse, the sky was doing that particular gray thing it does in November. Not quite raining, not quite not. The kind of sky that makes you feel like the world can't even be bothered to make a decision about you. He had a paper bag with his lunch in one hand and his keys in the other. The lunch his daughter had packed for him that morning, a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a sticky note that said, "You're still my dad. That doesn't change today." He hadn't eaten it. He'd been holding it for 4 hours inside the courtroom, and now he was holding it outside, and he still didn't think he could eat it without crying, so he just stood there on the steps with the sandwich and the note in the gray November sky. The divorce was final. 11 years. Done. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to feel. He'd been bracing for something, grief maybe, or relief, or some combination of both that would at least make sense. What he felt instead was the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting a losing battle for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still. He was 41 years old. He had a 12-year-old daughter named Piper, shared custody starting next week, a rented house in Brampton that his sister helped him find, and approximately nothing else to show for a decade and a bit of trying. He walked to his truck. There was a woman leaning against the car parked beside it. Not leaning exactly. Standing with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to wait without looking like they're waiting. She was wearing a coat that Elliot would later learn cost more than his monthly rent, though he wouldn't have known that then. She looked like someone who had somewhere to be everywhere always. She glanced at him. He glanced at her. He opened his truck door. "Elliot Dufresne," she said. He stopped. She said it the way people say things when they already know the answer. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yeah," he said. "I'm Camille Okafor," she said. "I've been waiting for you." Here's the thing about Camille Okafor that everyone in Toronto already knew. She was 38 years old, the founder and CEO of Parallax Health Systems, and she had built one of the largest private healthcare networks in the country from a single clinic in Scarborough that she'd opened with borrowed money and a business plan she'd revised 47 times. Here is the thing about Camille Okafor that almost nobody knew. 3 months earlier, her doctor had said the word bilateral in a sentence about her ovaries and the carefully constructed timeline of her life. The one she'd been quietly, methodically working toward, had collapsed like a building whose supports were pulled all at once. She had a daughter, 8 years old. Lena. The daughter was the part people really didn't know. Not adopted, not hidden exactly, just held close. Held away from the cameras and the quarterly earnings calls and the profiles in business magazines that called her visionary and relentless and, once memorably, the iron spine of Canadian healthcare. Lena lived with Camille's mother in Hamilton, spending weekends and school holidays with Camille, who drove the highway with her heels kicked off in the passenger seat and the radio on whatever station Lena liked that month. It was a system. It worked. Or it had worked for years, the way things work when you haven't yet encountered the thing they weren't designed for. The thing it hadn't been designed for was this. Lena's biological father had resurfaced. His name was Theo Brandt, and he was the kind of man whose surname alone opened doors, which he used primarily to make other people's lives smaller. He had never wanted Lena. He had signed papers years ago that said so clearly. But now that Lena was 8 and brilliant and being raised by a woman whose net worth had made a certain kind of person take notice, he'd changed his mind, or rather his lawyers had changed it for him. He wasn't after Lena. He was after what Lena represented, leverage. And the one vulnerability his lawyers had found, after months of searching, was that Camille Okafor was unmarried, had been unmarried for the entirety of Lena's life. And the judge assigned to the custody review, a man with famously traditional views who had been brought in from outside the jurisdiction at Theo's family's quiet insistence, was the kind of judge who wrote words like stability and two-parent household in his preliminary notes. Camille needed a husband, not forever, just long enough to get through the custody evaluation. She needed someone she could trust, which meant someone who had nothing to gain from betraying her, someone whose character was not for sale, someone who had already lost enough that they understood what it meant to fight for a child. She'd had her people look. Her people were good at looking. They'd found Elliot Dufresne. He didn't say yes. Not right away. She'd handed him a card and said she'd like 20 minutes of his time, somewhere that wasn't a courthouse parking lot if he was willing. He'd looked at the card for a long moment, then put it in his jacket pocket, then gotten into his truck and driven home, and made himself eat the sandwich his daughter had packed for him, standing over the kitchen sink. He called her 2 days later. They met at a coffee shop on Queen Street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu. Because Elliot had chosen it, and he hadn't chosen it to make a statement. It was just the coffee shop he knew. Camille arrived exactly on time, ordered a black coffee, and laid out the situation with the directness of someone who had sat across a table from hospital boards and government regulators, and was not, at this point in her life, interested in wasting words. Elliot listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You need someone to pretend to be your husband," he said. "Yes, for a custody evaluation, for approximately 4 months, possibly less, and then we file for a separation. Quietly, irreconcilable differences. My lawyers handle everything. Your name stays clean and you receive compensation for your time and the disruption to your life." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. It was the kind of gesture a person makes when they're trying to stay calm. "I don't want your money," he said. She hadn't expected that. She was good at expecting things, and she hadn't expected that. "Then what do you want?" He looked at her. "I want to understand why you picked me." She told him most of it, not all of it. She told him about Theo and the custody review and the judge and the particular cruelty of someone weaponizing a child they'd never cared about. She told him Lena was 8 and loved geography and could name every province and territory in order from west to east, which she'd learned specifically to impress her grandmother. She did not tell him about the doctor's appointment. She did not tell him about the word bilateral. That was hers. She was still carrying that part alone. "And you think this will work," he said. "A judge seeing a married woman. My lawyers believe it significantly improves our position. But you're not sure." "I'm never sure," she said. "I just move anyway." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not much. He was not a man who showed things easily on his face. She'd noticed that. She filed it away. "I have a daughter," he said. "Piper. She's 12. I know." She'd have to know something was going on. "She's not," he started again. "She pays attention. She always has. What would you want to tell her?" "The truth," he said. "Or close enough to it. That you're a friend who needs help and we're helping." He paused. She'd accept that. She's that kind of kid. Camille looked at him across the table. The coffee shop was getting loud around them, the lunch rush starting, and there was something almost strange-killer conversation in all this ordinary noise. "Os." "Okay," she said. "Okay, you agree to that?" "I agree to that." He was quiet again. Then he said, "What's her name? She know what's happening?" "She knows someone is trying to take her away from me," Camille said. "I told her that much because she would have figured it out anyway. She stopped. The word she'd been about to use was percept, came out instead, was softer. She sees things." Elliot nodded slowly. "Mine too," he said. He looked down at his cup. Then he looked up. "All right," he said. "Tell me what I need to do." The arrangement required things he hadn't anticipated. Not the legal things. Those were handled by a team of people in a glass-walled office in downtown Toronto who spoke with the brisk confidence of people billing by the hour. The paperwork was what it was. He signed what needed signings. He gave them his information and answered their questions, and left feeling like he'd just enrolled in a course whose syllabus he hadn't been fully shown. What he hadn't anticipated was the small, domestic machinery of a shared life. They'd agreed he would spend weekends at Camille's house in Forest Hill, a tall, narrow Victorian that managed to feel both expensive and somehow sparse, the way places feel when someone is there but not quite living in them. During the week, he'd be at his Brampton rental, working. Piper on his weeks, school runs and homework and whatever show she was watching at dinner. The first weekend, he brought a bag and stood in Camille's front hall and felt, acutely, like an imposter. Lena was there. She was small for 8 and had the kind of serious eyes that made you want to be straightforward with her. She looked at Elliot for a long moment when Camille introduced them, and then she said, "Are you good at board games?" "Depends on the game," he said. "We have Ticket to Ride. That one I'm decent at." "Mum's terrible at it," Lena said, with the calm authority of someone stating a geological fact. "She builds too fast, and then she runs out of trains." Camille behind her had the expression of a woman who was not going to confirm or deny this. They played Ticket to Ride after dinner. Lena won. Elliot came second. Camille did indeed run out of trains. The weeks were stranger than the weekends. During the week, the arrangement was mostly invisible. He went to work. He ran a small renovation company, just him and 2 guys he'd worked with for years. The kind of work that left his hands tired and his head usefully empty at the end of the day. He picked Piper up from school on his custody days, made dinner, helped with homework. He was careful not to say anything to Piper that wasn't true. He'd told her that a woman named Camille was in a difficult situation and he'd agreed to help her, and that some weekends he'd be in Toronto, and that it was nothing she needed to worry about. Piper had listened to all of this with the particular stillness that meant she was logging it away. "Is she nice?" she'd asked. He'd thought about it. "She's very direct, which I actually appreciate." "And you like her?" "I respect her," he said carefully. Piper had nodded once, the way she nodded when she was deciding not to push yet. He knew her tells. The situation with Theo Brandt began to accelerate in February. His lawyers filed a motion that Camille's team had been expecting, but that arrived harder than predicted. A request for an extended psychological evaluation of Lena, supervised by an assessor they'd nominated. Camille's lawyers pushed back. The judge set a date for a formal review in April. 3 days after the motion was filed, a photo appeared in a gossip column. Elliot and Camille leaving a restaurant in Yorkville where they'd been for what was technically a dinner arranged by her PR team to establish a public record. In the photo, they were just walking, his hand briefly at the small of her back, the way you put your hand on someone's back without thinking about it, the way married people do. The caption was not unkind. "Camille Okafor, is that a ring?" Within a week, it was on 3 more sites. By the 3rd week, someone had found Elliot, his name, his company, his divorce record, his Brampton address, and written one of those pieces that frames itself as reporting but is really just a collection of facts arranged to imply something. He didn't see it right away. Camille called him. "There's a piece," she said. "About you. I saw." His contractor friend Rodrigo had texted him a link at 6 in the morning. "I'm sorry. I thought we'd have more time before." "It's fine," he said. He said it the way he said things when they weren't entirely fine, but complaining about them served no purpose. "Media. I don't want to talk to them. You won't have to, but they may approach you." He was quiet. "Elliot." I said, "It's fine, Camille." She was quiet on her end. Then, "You're allowed to tell me if it isn't." That surprised him. He hadn't expected that from her. Not the permission, but the particular way she said it, like she meant it, like she was genuinely leaving the door open. "I know," he said. The piece had made things complicated at his Piper's school. Not complicate exactly, no one had said anything directly. But he'd felt it, the shift in how the other parents looked at him at pickup. The quick glances. A woman he'd chatted with at school events for 2 years had given him a look that he couldn't quite decode, something between curiosity and something more pointed. Piper had seen the piece online. She didn't say anything for 3 days. Then, on a Thursday night, they were doing the dishes after dinner. He washed. She dried, which was the system they'd had since she was 9, and she said without looking up from the plate she was drying, "That lady in the article. That's Camille." "Yeah," he said. "The one you're helping, yeah." She dried the plate carefully, put it in the stack, picked up another one. "She really needs the help," Piper said. It wasn't a question. "She does," Elliot said. "Her daughter," Piper said. "Someone's trying to take her daughter away, yeah." Piper was quiet for a moment. She put the second plate down. "Then it makes sense," she said. He looked at her. "I mean," she said, with the particular patience of a 12-year-old explaining something obvious to a well-meaning adult. "If someone was trying to take me away from you, you'd do whatever it took, wouldn't you?" He didn't answer right away. His throat had done something inconvenient. "Yeah," he finally said. "I would." She picked up the next dish. He had not expected her to make it simple. She had somehow made it simple. In March, Lena got sick, not seriously. A bad cold that turned into a chest infection that required antibiotics and a week home from school. Camille had cleared her calendar as much as she could, but there was a partnership negotiation she'd been working on for 11 months that had its final signing meeting on a Thursday, and she could not be there. She'd called Elliot. "I don't want to ask you this," she said. "Ask me," he said. "She's not bad. She gets anxious as when she's sick and I'm not there. If there were anyone else, I'd ask them, but my mother is with my aunt in Montreal this week, and—" "Camille, yes, I'll be there by 9. He drove up from Brampton. Lena was on the couch in the living room, with a blanket and a puzzle half-finished on the coffee table, the kind with 500 tiny pieces that she was apparently doing, because she found it calming, which Elliot thought was one of the most Lena things he'd ever heard. "Mom said you'd come," she told him when he arrived. "She said you would. Matter of fact. Not smug. Just settled." He sat in the armchair across from her, and she went back to her puzzle, and he made her tea, because she'd said she wanted tea, which struck him as a very adult request for an 8-year-old, and he told her so. "I've had tea when I'm sick since I was 5, she said. "It helps the throat." "Fair enough," he said. They spent the day mostly in comfortable quiet. She showed him her geography books. He told her he'd worked a construction job once in Yellowknife, and she had 17 immediate questions about Yellowknife, which he answered as accurately as he could, and she corrected him once on a population statistic. and he conceded the point because she was right. Around 3 in the afternoon, she fell asleep on the couch. He put the blanket more squarely over her and sat back in the armchair and looked out the window at the March gray of Forest Hill and thought about how strange life was, its ability to rout you into moments you hadn't foreseen. Camille came home at 5:30. She came into the living room quietly and stood in the doorway and looked at Lena sleeping, and then she looked at him, and there was something in her face he hadn't seen before. Not the CEO face, not the careful face she wore at their public dinners, but something underneath it, something that looked like exhaustion and gratitude and possibly something else that she shut down quickly when she caught him looking. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low. "She did all the work," he said. "I just sat." Camille looked at Lena again. "She's been doing that since she was born," she said quietly. "Doing all the work. I used to worry about it. Now I just try to keep up." He didn't say anything. Sometimes the best thing was to not say anything. The custody review was set for April 14th. The week before it, Camille's lawyer called Elliot and asked him to come in. He went. He sat in the glass-walled office, and a woman named Patricia, who was the kind of calm that came from 30 years of family law, walked him through what to expect. At the end of the meeting, Patricia looked at him over her glasses. "The judge is going to ask you about your relationship with Lena," she said, "not just with Camille." "With Lena. All right, he'll be looking for authenticity." She paused. "The thing is, Mr. Dufresne, in my experience, authenticity is one of the things that's very difficult to fake convincingly." He nodded. "So my advice," she said, "is simply to be honest about the parts you can be honest about." He thought about Lena asleep on the couch with her geography book. He thought about her correcting his Yellowknife statistic without a trace of self-consciousness. He thought about Ticket to Ride and Tea for a Sore Throat, and the way she said, "Mum said you would come." Settled certain like it wasn't even a question. "That won't be a problem," he said. The night before the review, Camille called him. It was late, and he was still up, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the kitchen with the lights low. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay." She was quiet for a moment. He waited. "In November," she said, "before I found you, there was an appointment, a medical one." Another pause. "They told me that having another biological child wasn't. Some complications they'd found. It wasn't a surprise exactly, but it was." She stopped. It was a door closing. And Lena was already so much of everything, and now there was this other thing, and the idea of someone taking her. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He sat in the low kitchen light and understood, finally, the full shape of it. Not just the custody battle, not just the practical problem she'd presented to him in that coffee shop on Queen Street. The whole thing, all of it. "I'm sorry," he said, "that you've been carrying that. I don't usually," she started. Stopped. "I don't tell people things like that. I know, I'm not sure why I told you." He thought about it. "Maybe," he said, "because I've been inside it with you long enough that it stopped feeling like you'd be giving something away." She was quiet for a long time. "Maybe," she said. The review lasted 2 days. Theo Brandt's lawyers were good. They were the expensive kind of good, the kind that knew how to say damaging things in the language of concern. They talked about Lena's living arrangements, about the commute between Hamilton and Toronto, about the demands of Camille's schedule. They were careful and methodical, and the whole thing had the quality of watching someone dismantle something carefully, piece by piece. Camille sat through it with the stillness of someone who had learned to take hits without moving. Elliot sat beside her. He answered when he was asked. He was honest, as Patricia had advised, about the parts he could be honest about. The judge asked him how he'd describe his relationship with Lena. He thought for a moment. He stopped, started again. "She's a person who takes things seriously, who pays attention. She asks better questions than most adults I know." He paused. "My daughter is 12. There are moments where I see something in Lena and I think, that's what good parenting looks like. Whatever Camille has done, she's raised someone who meets the world without flinching." He stopped himself. "That's what I know about Lena." There was a brief silence in the room. The judge wrote something down. They were outside when Camille's phone rang with the result. 3 weeks after the review, standing in the parking structure under her office building because she'd gotten the call unexpectedly and had stepped away from a meeting, and Elliot had driven down to be there because he'd said he would. He watched her face as she listened. He watched the thing she'd been holding for months shift. Not collapse. She wasn't someone who collapsed. But shift. A small, careful unlocking. She hung up. "The motion was denied," she said. "Supervised visitation if Theo pursues it, which Patricia says he won't." "Lena's okay," he said. "Lena's okay." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She stood for a moment, and he saw it, the thing under the CEO face, the thing she'd let him see once before on a March evening in her living room. Except this time, she didn't shut it down. "Thank you," she said. "Not the professional thank you. The other kind. You would have found a way," he said. "You always do." "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to this time. The separation paperwork existed, ready in Patricia's files. They didn't file it in April. They didn't file it in May. In June, Piper came with him to a Sunday dinner at Camille's. The first time because Piper had asked if she could meet Lena. And Lena had said, through Camille, that she'd heard about the daughter who'd packed the turkey sandwich and she had questions about that story. They sat at the dining room table and Lena asked Piper about the sandwich with the gravity of a documentary interviewer. And Piper told the whole story, and Camille caught Elliot's eye across the table and they both looked away at approximately the same moment. In July, Camille drove down to Brampton on a Tuesday evening for no particular reason. She said she'd been in the area. She hadn't been in the area. Brampton was not on the way to anywhere she'd been. He made her dinner. She stayed 3 hours and they talked not about any of the things that had defined the past months, just about ordinary things. A renovation job he was working on, a problem she'd been thinking through at work, Lena's new obsession with the history of the Canadian Pacific Railway. When she was leaving, she stood at the door for a moment longer than leaving required. "Elliot," she said. She looked at him. Then she said, "I'm going to call you tomorrow." "Okay," he said. Not about any of it. Just to call." He understood what she was asking. He nodded. "I'll pick up," he said. She drove away. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the July evening, the neighborhood settling into its quiet, the maple at the end of the driveway just starting to think about changing color. The way they do in August, when nobody's quite paying attention. He thought about Piper, who had packed him a sandwich on the worst morning of a very long year, and who had looked at him across a sink full of dishes and made the complicated simple. He thought about Lena, who had said, "Mum said you'd come," not a hope, not a wish, just a fact she'd already decided was true. He went back inside. He was smiling, just slightly, in the way that people smile when they're not trying to, when something has settled in their chest that they hadn't known was unsettled. The maple stood where it had always stood. The street was quiet. There are some things you don't plan for, not because you weren't careful enough, or because you weren't paying attention, but because they come from the direction you forgot to watch. They come through the side door, in November light, with a paper bag and a sticky note, and a child who already knows something that the adults haven't said out loud yet. They always know. That's what makes them worth everything.